Today we'll be looking at... Oh, wrong image. There we go. Alright, from the top. Today we'll be looking at the 17th century French philosopher René Descartes. Despite Descartes living well before the invention of the hot air balloon, to this day he's still labelled as a modern philosopher, given the impressive title of the father of modern philosophy. I mean, I haven't even attained the title of a normal father yet. Anyway, back to Descartes. The Frenchman was one of the first rationalists who used his reason alone to get closer to the truth, through his well-known method of doubt. I'm not really sure what everyone else was doing before the existence of doubt, but there we go. Unless you clicked on this video by accident, you've seen the title, so you know we'll be looking at Descartes' most compelling argument for the existence of God. Now, I said compelling, but if we're being honest, reading Descartes now can feel like anything but compelling, with his writing style causing me, at least, to contemplate making a video on a different philosopher. But to be fair to them, convoluted and obtuse writing was in style at the time. Putting on my tinfoil hat for a second, from my experience of studying this period, it seemed like the battle of British empiricists against European rationalists caused each faction to hide their arguments in complicated code, for the sole purpose of delaying the other side from deciphering its contents and supply a counter-argument. When we read these arguments now, it feels like a punishment, but in actuality, when you break through all the jargon, there is gold to be found. This is no different with Descartes' ontological argument for the existence of God, ontological here just meaning the study of existence, and it's found in his book Principles of Philosophy. To be specific here, Descartes' conception of God aligns with the traditional all-powerful, all-knowing and infinite deity, as each trait is a necessity as his reasoning will reveal. Now, with this context covered, let me take you back to the early 1600s when Descartes was making his case for God. Descartes' claim: only God could be the cause of our idea of God. For starters, let's quickly unpack the word cause, as it helps us understand his reasoning a bit more. When Descartes says that God must be the cause of our idea of God, he's asking us to consider how we even have an idea of a perfect being in the first place. To Descartes, the explanation is simple, and it's tied to God's perfect nature being a necessity. Let me explain. Without the omnipotent deity, i.e. the all-powerful being, planting the idea in us, how can we even conceive what perfection is? And so he concludes that it's logically impossible for us to conceive of an all-perfect being without an initial cause planting this perfect idea in us in the first place. In other words, you can't think of something perfect without an initial cause from the source itself, i.e. God. The Rebuttals. It's this analytical approach that sets Descartes apart from theologians like Thomas Aquinas, who would go a step further and say that God's perfect nature is beyond our human comprehension, and we can't begin to grasp God's essence in the rational sense. Descartes, being a rationalist, would disagree with Aquinas and uses an analogy of a machine to embolden his claim. In his view, the construction of a machine that requires great skill comes with it the necessity of a person who had the idea of this machine, and from looking at the construction, we have a right to inquire about the original source in which we derive it. To Descartes, the skillful properties of the machine must also exist within this original cause for it to be possible to create something of this skill in the first place. It should be mentioned here that this argument from design was further expanded by William Paley a couple centuries later in 1802 with his watchmaker analogy. Briefly, Paley says that if you stumble upon an intricate watch on the floor, there has to have been a skilled maker responsible for its construction, and its place on the floor had to have had a prior cause. However, there are atheists like Richard Dawkins with his blind watchmaker rebuttal who would argue that these arguments from design jump to conclusions too quickly. It's also easy to become dizzy running in circles with these arguments from design. For example, with Descartes' machine analogy or the similar watchmaker analogy, you can keep asking questions like, well, who designed the designer? And following the logic that the designer has to have been more intelligent than its creation in isolation, you don't need to regress far until your previous designer has to have been impossibly intelligent. You can also point to Descartes' argument being outdated, with Darwin's theory of evolution not existing until 200 years after his lifetime. It's even more damning when we consider how, with evolution, we're able to look ahead and imagine an idea of perfection from our imperfect standpoint, as we're able to extrapolate into the future. So there are some holes in Descartes' logic. God's infinite nature. Descartes, not being one for half measures, doesn't stop at perfection, and uses the same logic with God's characteristic of being infinite also being a necessity. Descartes would argue that God also planted this idea in us, as in his view it wouldn't make sense for us to hold this idea of an all-perfect infinite God if we are just finite beings. Descartes' stance is that if we live in a finite world where everything is dependent, i.e. abides by the laws of cause and effect, we would also need one singular, infinite, independent substance that set these finite effects in motion. Descartes would argue that it's not possible for an effect to exist without a cause imposing the reality on it, as, in his words, something cannot arise from nothing. He asks us to picture a stone that doesn't yet exist. For this stone to exist, it would need to be produced by something of similar features to the stone's nature, and without any causal link, it cannot become a reality. Now, even in the 1600s, this concept wasn't entirely new, as its roots date back to the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, with his concept of the prime mover, that consequently influenced the aforementioned Thomas Aquinas. Aristotle believed that as every motion requires some prior mover or cause, there has to be a first mover that initiates all change, an unmoved mover. Because of this logical necessity, Descartes and Aristotle, if they were alive at the same time, would concur that God's characteristics must include being infinite, perfect, and unchanged. Closing thoughts. Coming to the end of this video, you may not be convinced with Descartes' argument, and there are definitely holes to be found. However, there is a strong case for the necessity of God's attributes, and even if one of the characteristics we've discussed is granted, then his existence must also be guaranteed. Thanks for watching.